Hey guys, what's up and welcome to a new Tesla update video. So today, as per usual, let's go over Tesla. Let's go over what is happening in the market, what we can expect moving forward with Tesla and all of that good stuff. So all that being said and done, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit that like button as it does help a lot. This is not financial advice. I am not a financial advisor. And of course, my membership section on YouTube is live. The link is down below. You can access all my intraday thoughts, posts, updates, etc. Options flow on Tesla every single day the market is open for just $2.99 a month. In my opinion, I tried making it something that you don't have to even really think about. Just a cup of coffee, essentially. Link is below in the description. If you're interested, definitely check that out. But jumping right into it, Tesla closing the day, unfortunately, down yet again, pretty much 1% on the day, closing at pretty much exactly at 155.5 per share. Which thankfully, on the bright side in this case, we can say compared to the market, you can argue that Tesla actually did not too bad. QQQ down 1.24%. QQQ was down more than Tesla was itself. Normally, Tesla will be down about double the amount of QQQ, right? So about closer to 3%, I would say roughly. So Tesla holding up, honestly, pretty darn well, all things considered, in my opinion. Now, so let's zoom into the daily chart here and let's talk about essentially what's happening. Actually, before we do that, very quickly, one of the main news that did come out today is the fact that Tesla is going to be essentially doing a shareholder meeting, if you will, in June, where essentially shareholders can vote, of course, with their shares on, whether or not they want to pretty much reinstate that pay package, that, compensation package that Elon Musk was vetoed essentially from the Delaware court a few months ago. And they can pretty much reinstate that as a shareholder vote because, that's kind of how it works, right? Shareholders pretty much decide that, at least the majority of them. So keep that in mind. That's going to be pretty crucial. So we have a lot of two major catalysts moving into June. By the way, June is one of Tesla's best months, but obviously in June we have this. And then not too much farther out from June, and I believe it was August 8th, we have that robotaxi event. So June to August, pretty spicy kind of, potential shift in momentum setting up, and we'll see how this actually ends up playing out. We'll see what kind of potential momentum shift this may have in Tesla stock as well, with a lot of people understanding that the main caveat behind Tesla's success is really Elon and his attention to Tesla, if that makes sense. And we all know that this is going to be one of those main things that will, of course, help that situation out. But regardless, moving back to the technicals, talking about the daily chart first, right? The daily chart is interesting. So unfortunately, we did sell off a little bit towards the end of the day, right? We could have actually held off and had a pretty darn bullish looking daily candle today if we didn't have this little sell-off towards the remainder of the day, which is a little bit unfortunate. But moving over to the daily, regardless, you can see it is showing some buying pressure coming in pretty much around the mid to low 150s, right? Yesterday we had a lot of buying pressure come in, though that of course was helped by the market. But today, even though the market was down a pretty sizable amount, a 1.25% drop for the QQQ, it's not little, right? For something like a massive index like the QQQ to drop that much, it's a fair amount in a day. That's a pretty decent drop for the index, right? And again, Tesla holding up is good. It's a good thing to see, right? It's a very nice thing to see. QQQ close actually near the bottom of the day, while Tesla, somewhere around the middle of the, of the trading range, we'll say, right? But again, the point I'm trying to make here is we're constantly seeing buyers really step in around that mid to low 150s, which is a good thing to see because that is going to be a major area of in theory, of course, demand, right? And, it shouldn't be surprising, as we talked about this before, right? It happened all the way over here when we dropped down to this, 150s-ish range, massive bottoming and massive reversal, right? Same kind of a little bit of, situations like that happening here with that fair value gap, of course, over here. And if we go all the way over to the left over here back in 2020, right? Same idea, right? A lot of contention and volume that came in around this general area, right? This one, mid-ish, we'll say 150s acted as a pretty massive resistance. And then once it finally broke, you can see the move that followed after that. So it is a pretty important area just through historical price action, for Tesla to, in theory, at least have a lot of demand. If I open up this, for instance, Lux Algo, smart money concept, which almost feels like, I don't know, kind of like cliche to use, honestly. But, it does show that this is essentially the main thing I use it for is order blocks, right? And it does show that, there is, of course, a massive order block sitting pretty much in this 150s range. And that's exactly where we're trading in right now. So it's a pretty crucial level to hold. But the most important way to look at this is as follows, right? If Tesla can ever recapture, in my opinion, 160, right? Pretty much above 160 and a half to make it a little bit more convincing, I guess, but pretty much just above 160. If Tesla can recapture the daily back above 160, close the candle, and especially start, kind of re-holding above that level, I personally believe that Tesla is ready for a recovery essentially. I do think that the recovery begins, and I think it can finally find some life, and it can finally make its way back up, and it can stop just pretty much bleeding out for quite a while now. I really think that that will most likely begin that recovery. However, that's an obviously, a decent if, right? It's not a guarantee. It's one of those things where you just kind of let the levels decide for you. However, with that being said, if we lose this, 154 to about this 152-ish range, roughly that $2-ish range, that most likely means that, there is a decent possibility that we drop back into the 140s, right? There is a decent possibility we drop back down into the 140s and ultimately retest this. I don't know if I have it on the weekly. Let me see. Yeah, I do have it on the weekly. And ultimately retest this overall trend line, right, that we've created from these two touch points right here, all the way back in 2020, all the way back here in 2022. And pretty much, what do you know, another 2 years later, right? So, which is actually interesting because this is 2020. 2 years later, 2020, well, 23, I guess. But I mean, it was January of 23, so it's not too much. It's not like full 3 years, but we'll just say 2.5 years. Boom, we're here. And then pretty much, about another close to 2 years, we'll say. Not exactly 2 years, but not like substantially far from it, like a year and a half or so, right? Give or take, but not too much farther away is what I'm trying to say. We're coming back potentially once again to retest that. But every single time we've come to this trend line overall, it's followed with not only massive support, right? But every single time we've come down into it, it's followed back with a pretty substantial rally both times so far. Will this time be any different? Who knows? I know for a fact if we drop below 150, a lot of people will be screaming for 100. We'll be screaming for potentially even lower than 100, all the way down to like the 60s potentially, right? I don't think that'll happen. It's not it's not impossible. I just think the likelihood of coming down to the 60s is extremely low, but not zero, of course. Maybe like a 5% chance of happening, maximum 10% in my opinion. But coming down to the 140s is very realistic, right? Potentially post earnings, right? Absolutely a very realistic possibility. So again, the point I'm just trying to make, I'm not trying to predict anything. I'm just looking strictly off of historical chart performance, right? History often rhymes with the stock market and the chart performance, right? Every single time we've bounced off of this trend line that we have created, it's been a pretty substantial rally not too long after. We'll see if this time is any different or if we even come down to it at all, right? The next thing to look at on the weekly that's kind of important to understand is the fact that the RSI. I know a lot of people don't like the RSI. They like it's a useless indicator, it's lagging indicator, etc. And for the most part, I do agree in certain aspects. But when you're looking at it on the daily, on the weekly, there is some merit to it. For instance, when you're looking at divergences, or in this case, you're looking for just more pattern recognition. For instance, back here where Tesla, dropped pretty much into its lowest point, right? The RSI was pretty much at 30, if not lower. Massive rally followed not too long after. Okay, let's look at another example. This was back when the whole market was tanking. Elon was selling, huge pressure on Tesla stock, right? Came all the way down to $100. RSI also went sub 30. And then what happened after that? Massive rally. And right now we're sitting at a pretty much 34-ish RSI, not too far off from that, potential sub 30. The point I'm trying to make here is whenever it gets around that 30, if not even below 30 on the weekly chart specifically, usually a substantial rally is followed, not too long after. Doesn't mean it has to happen this time. No. But again, just, looking at historical performance and price action on the chart, just something to kind of keep in mind, right? So those are the main things I'm looking at there. Now, the next thing I want to take a look at is, of course, going to be my favorite indicator, the band's regression, right? The daily chart. We're still sitting in quite oversold territory, right? The red line, which is pretty much the 140s, will be substantially, severely oversold territory. But, we are still sitting in very oversold territory, at least for the short term, right here in the band's regression, with that kind of mean reversion, if you will, being pretty much around the, high 160s to low 170s, which is this white line over here, which is roughly that 20-day moving average. It usually comes in hand with it, right? So, that's kind of like usually where the price usually reverts to. For instance, if I look at it on the daily here, you can see, it's not very often that Tesla comes down to the second yellow line, if not even the red line, and stays there for too long before reverting back to the mean, that white line in the center. Obviously, there's instances where it does stay a little bit longer, but usually those are off of something major like earnings, which unfortunately we have coming up not too long, in just under a week, right? So that is something that is, of course, the risk in this situation. But the point I'm trying to make here is almost always whenever it comes down to these very oversold levels, like it did just too recently over here, it almost always comes back to that mean. Same thing on the 4-hour chart, right? Every single time it comes into these oversold territories, it reverts back to the mean. Now, it doesn't mean it has to necessarily straight up bounce back up into it. It could, but at the very least, what it means is, for instance, like it did over here, it came back down into it. It kind of roughly reverted, but then came back down into oversold territories, but it didn't necessarily bounce right back up directly into it. It kind of just went sideways. But the point I'm trying to make here is at the very least, we base. At the very least, we at least should base, at least until earnings, around this 150s range, which is, again, what I said a few days ago. And potentially really do, a whole lot of nothing. Honestly, that is a possibility. We do a whole lot of nothing up until earnings as we kind of base around here. The kind of, this indicator here sort of catches up to the price action. And then it almost reverts back to the mean just from the sake of kind of going sideways, which is, of course, one of the ways to, calm down for the stock, essentially, right? So that is a possibility as well. But again, on the 4-hour chart, on the daily chart, right, you still have the bullish divergences on the RSI. We still have the stochastic, sitting at pretty oversold territories, right? On the 4-hour, for instance, the daily is not too oversold just yet, but it's definitely approaching it, right? The weekly has been oversold for quite a long time on the stochastic. You can see down here, it's just been pretty much scraping the bottom of the barrel for quite some time, which again, we can look at historical performances and see how that, occurred before. And you can see here, during this time where Elon was selling and we did go down to 100, it was also scraping the bottom for quite some time, right? Arguably getting pretty close to as long as we've been scraping the bottom now, like from this, price action we've had for the past several weeks. And you can see what happened not too long after that. Will earnings potentially be that catalyst that actually propels it forward? It might be. All I know is that a lot of people are expecting this earnings to be a disaster show, pretty much just a horror movie, and Tesla to pretty much tank down even further post earnings. People are quite bearish moving into it, rightfully so, don't get me wrong, but maybe the people are too bearish. We'll see. Obviously, nobody knows. But, just keep that in mind, right? Sentiment is extremely bearish going into earnings. Though, to be fair, it was also extremely bearish when we went into earnings all the way back here. And, we still did tank after that. So, obviously, no one knows for sure. But it's just important to take sentiment into account as well. But that's kind of the main thing I'm looking at right now. Obviously, we're below pretty much every moving indicator. Nothing to really talk about there. The 21 EMA, we're below that 20-day moving average. We're below that 200. We're below that. We're below everything that really matters. So obviously, we're still in a downtrend. Obviously, we're still in a bearish trend. We're not trying to say that Tesla's done bleeding and Tesla's time to rally. Not at all. Not yet, at least. We're kind of just trying to figure out, okay, where could the bottom be, right? Where can the bottom finally show up for Tesla? And again, I want to make it clear, right? If we look at the daily chart here, right, we have, of course, this, channel that we were been, zigzagging in for quite some time. You can argue the fact that we did break down below it, and now we're hugging, below the channel, potentially coming back up to retest that at 160, right? But we're below the channel. We broke down below it. That's not good. That's bearish, which it is, of course. But again, this is why these kind of trend lines and channels, they're somewhat subjective because you can fit them to shape a specific narrative. Again, this one looks bearish. Let's go to the weekly. It's a different one that I redrew specifically for the weekly chart. What do you know? It doesn't look as bearish anymore. In fact, we're actually so far finding a little bit of a bounce. Nothing major, of course, but a little bit of a bounce so far at the bottom of the channel, which happens to line up pretty beautifully here. So that's why it's kind of, it's more of a perspective thing. It's a little subjective, right? You want to take these things with a little bit of a grain of salt, which is why I like to look more at horizontal support and resistances, supply and demands more so than, drawing, trend lines. At least I like to. Trend lines to me are just like a very rough depiction. I try not putting too much weight into them, but regardless, it's still something to kind of note. Volume today was mediocre, nothing too crazy, but all in all, the market is at a point where I personally would not be surprised if it does find a bounce, right? The market has been selling off pretty substantially, so if the market finally finds a bounce, right, for instance, QQQ at the volume profile, at the gap fill, fair value gap has been filled as well. Not a bad place for the QQQ to potentially find at least some bit of a bounce over here, which wouldn't surprise me whatsoever. And if that happens, of course, Tesla should, in theory, of course, be happy with that and follow through when follow along, but you never really know with the stock as well. So we'll see what happens. But one thing I will say, and I'll always say this for Tesla stock, as painful as it is and as kind of sucky as it can be, this stock could fall down pretty aggressively and pretty quickly as we've been seeing, but a lot of people forget it can rise up pretty much just as fast, if not in some cases faster than it fell. It is just one of those stocks. It's an elevator down and an elevator back up. Just don't forget that, right? Sometimes the stock can do those kind of things and catch people off guard both ways. So we'll see. But all in all, thank you so much for watching. The most important levels to watch for 160, I think that will pretty much seal this potentially being a real bottom. And if we lose about 154 to 152, most likely 140s are next. But with all that being said and done, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you for the next one. Peace.